Welcome to another episode of the Swarm Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode is sponsored by Zadie Auctions. Check out the new catalog for the forthcoming Auction 8, Sunday, March 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern. 110 items including many Haggadahs, a complete set of Slavita Torah, 3 personal Svarim of Rabbi Kiva Eger, a personal signed Sefer of Nechidah, letters, many Sifrei site. Check out Zadie.com, ZAIDY.com, and you can find a link in the show notes where you can register and bid on items now. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me at svarmchatter@gmail.com or you can find link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp community, as well as the Svarm Chatter WhatsApp status, where I post new Svarm, new books, book deals, and more. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Hasia, who is Professor Emerita and the director of the Goldstein-Goren Center for American Jewish History at New York University, NYU, and is author of numerous books and articles. And we'll be discussing her book, Roads Taken, which is the Great Jewish Migrations to the New World and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. So basically about Jewish peddlers. Although it says New World and we'll focus in the United States, it's not only about the United States, it's about the New World, and we'll discuss what that means. And this was also published by Yale University Press. So thank you, Professor Diner, for joining me.
My pleasure.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I have a PhD in American history, and I decided in the course of my training that it would be particularly interesting as a scholar of the United States to use the experience of the Jews, immigrants, and second and third generations over the course of time as a way to understand issues of class, race, religion in the American context. And in the end, I think what my work did is it gave an American perspective to modern Jewish history and a Jewish perspective to American history.
So as you mentioned, you got your PhD and you've written a lot on American Jewish history. So this book is not specifically, though, about American Jews. It's about peddlers. How did you get to this book?
Right. So it's a great question, and it's a little bit of a story, if you can bear with me. So on the one hand, in the course of other projects, I kept running across Jews as peddlers. And it, kind of registered in my mind that it's an odd occupation, odd in the sense that here are people who are almost always men, who, rather than working in a factory or working in a shop or working in a mill or in an office, make their first footsteps in the new country, in this case, the United States, or in the case of my other work, by going out on the road, on their back, and going house to house, selling stuff to pretty ordinary customers. And so what we know is that most immigrants, when they come to the United States, work in a kind of ethnic enclave. They work among other Jews, among other Italians, other Poles, other Swedes. Here are a group of men who day in and day out, lived their lives and made their living by interacting with, let's call them strangers, with the people who live in this land. And I thought, how interesting. So it had struck me as kind of really interesting. Never did anything with it. But then at some point, and I'd say in the early 2000s, I always say sometime before the pandemic, my husband and I were vacationing in the Adirondack Mountains. So we were looking at the guidebook for the mountains, and then we were approaching a town called Tupper Lake, New York. And in the guidebook, it said, Tupper Lake is a depressed former center of the logging industry. And the only tourist attraction in Tupper Lake is a restored synagogue known as the Peddlers Shul. So, oh my gosh. So we've got to stop there. And so it was a beautiful little gem of a building. I found out it was built in 1905, and the story, and it was restored by both the descendants of the people who had built it and who had worshipped there, that is the Jews of Tupper Lake. It was also restored and maintained by the town. And there are no Jews in the town, but they saw this as a tourist attraction. They saw this as really a lovely part of their own history. So we went on the tour, and the tour guide explained that there had been a few Jewish families in Tupper Lake who owned a few of the dry goods stores. And mostly of German background. And in the early 20th century, a group of Jewish immigrant men from Poland, Lithuania. She got the name wrong. She called it Lithonia, but I did not say anything. And she said, came to the United States. They left their wives and children in New York, and they came up to Tupper Lake to peddle. And so they got their goods from the few Jewish merchants who were already there, and they went out on the road and sold, to the families in the logging camps and to the farmers. And then she said, one by one, as they had saved enough money, they stopped peddling, opened stores in Tupper Lake, brought their families up from New York. And so by 1905, there were enough. Funny, they now all own dry goods stores and clothing stores. And by then there were enough people, Jews living in the town to warrant the building of this little synagogue. And then over the course of the next generation, their children who became American educated didn't want to stay in Tupper Lake, particularly since the economy of Tupper Lake declined. And so one by one, their children or grandchildren left. And I was listening to her and I thought, this can't just be an upstate New York story. I knew it was a Mississippi story. I knew it was a Georgia story. I knew it was a California story, a Michigan story. And it just set me off on the road, literally using the title of the book, to try to look at what was this unusual, in a way, almost on a very superficial level, how different was this Tupper Lake experience from the experience, again, of these same kinds of Jewish men in Texas, in Oklahoma, in South Dakota. And as I was doing this, I just kept seeing more and more references to South Africa, to Australia, to Ireland, to the Caribbean, to parts of South America. And I recognized that what was going on. And the Tupper Lake story is just like a little dot, a grain of sand in this, that Jews looking to leave their old homes, their previous homes, and to go to new places that were opening up as a result of economic change and as a result of colonialism, used this familiar Jewish occupation as the kind of engine that facilitated their making a living, getting started, making a living, and eventually becoming integrated into the society.
So there's a number of things to follow up on over there. But first of all, as you say, you did not restrict yourself to American Jewish peddlers. So even though that's, I guess, I would say probably the core focus, right? That you still, as you said, you discussed peddlers in other countries as well. But you mentioned a number of times peddlers versus stores and dry goods and clothing business and other industries. Define peddler. When we say peddler, what does a peddler mean, especially in this context of your research and your book, as opposed to other occupations?
Right. They're on their feet. Hence we get the word, pedestrian. I mean, and look, eventually they get horse and cart, or an ox and cart, or a donkey and cart, depending on where they are. But they don't have a fixed place of business. And they go out every day, house to house, knocking on the door, selling stuff, as opposed to the owner of a dry goods store, the owner of a men's clothing store, or whatever other kinds of, permanent shop where the customers come to them. These men went out and they went to the customers.
The other thing that I wanted to follow up with on you as well, another thing that you mentioned is that they were two parts. One about the male, one about the Jewishness. But let's go with the male part first. You said they were predominantly male.
They were only male. They were not predominantly male. They were only men. In Europe and in parts of the Ottoman Empire, actually, there were Jewish women who were peddlers. But that was not true in these New World settings. So they were only men.
Now, how about religion? You said it was like a Jewish occupation. Was this only Jews, or were there other nationalities, other religions, religious groups doing this?
Great question. So, certainly the Jews were not the only peddlers. And in certain regions, the typical peddler was a son, and back to a male, of a failed New England farm. They were often known as Yankee peddlers. And these were Protestant men. There were some Germans who peddled, some Irish. The only other group in which one could say that peddling was the engine that drove their migration were Arab peddlers. from what would now be called Syria. So it was called Mount Lebanon. So these were Christian Arabs. Interestingly, they went to the exact same places Jewish peddlers went: the American South, the American Midwest, South Africa, Australia, the British Isles. And so now they tended to avoid each other because the peddler always had a fixed route. And so they kept away from each other because didn't want to compete over customers, or really couldn't compete. But they are the only other group in which you could say that was the kind of chief first occupation for immigrant men.
Why? Why was peddling or being a peddler something that drove Jewish migration?
Yeah, so that's again a great question. So on the one hand, you could say this is something they knew. I mean, this is what they had been doing, really since the Middle Ages, in both, multiple parts of Europe and in the Ottoman Empire. So it was a familiar occupation. Nobody would bat their eyes, say, "What, peddler?" That's what Jews did, and they were primarily, Jewish peddlers, Jewish merchants by foot. Were in some places the majority of the Jewish population in Alsace, in Lithuania, in Romania. And so it was in a way a very short step from doing it in the Rhineland and then doing it in upstate New York. So it was familiar. The other is that Jews, and it would be true for Arabs, and I didn't study them, and that would have been a really interesting study to compare. But Jewish peddlers relied on Jewish credit networks. And so the Jewish peddlers got their goods from a Jewish wholesaler or a Jewish shopkeeper. That wholesaler was the one who gave them the goods, gave them a route, and facilitated their life on the road. And also, and when we get to the Jewish part of it, usually the peddlers always had a weekly cycle, and they came back on Friday to whatever was the kind of hub of Jewish life, which is where their creditors lived, right? And the creditor would usually put them up for the Sabbath. They would get a bed to sleep in. They would, they might or might not go to synagogue on Friday night or on Saturday morning, but that was their sort of Jewish communal life. But it was completely connected to their business lives. So the creditor was the person who also put them up for the Sabbath. The creditor's wife would usually do the cooking for them for the, Friday night, Saturday. And then Sunday morning, they'd go back off on the road. And so in many parts of the world, like in Ireland, they were called weekly men because they came the same day every week. And in parts of South America, they were called semana necks, semana being the Spanish word for week. And sometimes they called themselves Wochers from Woch, a week in Yiddish or German. So this was the pattern, and it always connected them to the Jewish population. And also some of these peddlers, when they had saved enough money and they would get a wagon, a horse and wagon, would engage in other kinds of economic activities, which tied them back to other Jewish business people. So they might collect what we would describe as junk, refuse, bones, feathers, just stuff lying around, pieces of metal, and they'd bring it back to Jewish owners of junkyards, we would call them actually recyclers now, and who would then make a profit off of what the peddler had collected. So it says they were the kind of foot soldiers of the Jewish economy in all of these places.
So I want to get shortly, we'll get to the religion, the Jewish religion aspect of this, how this played into it. But before that, so what years are we talking about that drove migration? There was a boom, so to speak. What years is that? And also, you explained how Jews were peddlers, but what drove this? I guess what specifically drove that? When was the boom and what drove that?
Okay.
That suddenly they were going to pick up and now all migrate as peddlers. Not all, but a lot of them.
Okay. Yeah, well, a lot. About 1/3 of all Jews left that sort of big region. Well, what drove that is the declining opportunities for making a living in the places where they lived. And there were too many people, too many Jews, too many young people who could never get started in life. They couldn't marry. They couldn't because the economic conditions were so tough. And so migration was the great escape valve. And this is taking place as, again, these, what I'm calling the New World, opened up for settlement and development. So I begin this in the late 18th century when there's a pretty large influx of Jews from Lithuania is a really important part of this, but from Lithuania and other parts of northern Germany to the British Isles. Okay. And they're all over England in particular selling. But by the 80s, as the United States begins to really take off economically, we see this mass Jewish migration. And so between 1820 and the 90s, about 3+ million Jews come to the United States. And until about the 1870s, peddling is the most common occupation for them. And and then after that, the migration shifts, or in a way simultaneous, by the 1890s, 1900, South Africa is opening up. Okay, after the resolution of the that it goes into British hands, parts of the Caribbean, South America. So this goes on really into the 1920s and 1930s. As kind of last gasps. And so amusingly, while I was working on this, I happened to be speaking to a cousin, and she said, "Oh, what are you writing these days?" And I told her, and she said, "Did you know my father was a peddler? He came from Russia. He could not get out. He could not get into the United States because of the immigration. There, he couldn't get a visa. And so he went to Cuba and he sold ties and handkerchiefs and suspenders door to door in Cuba." And so I hadn't known that, but there's again that last, sort of, in the 20s and 30s, but it's basically people who had to leave and they stayed home. There was no place for them in the economy. And here were wide open areas for taking your first steps, making some money, and being able to lead a kind of normal life of settling down, getting married, having children, and the like, and moving into a more comfortable economic situation.
Where were they coming from? Was it predominantly East Europe? Were they coming from Western Europe as well, these Jews?
As well. So one of the biggest senders in the 1840s and 50s was Alsace. So that eastern part of France that sometimes is Germany. And they came from Bavaria, from Posen, communities up and down the Rhineland. They were coming from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Again, Lithuania was terribly important, but they're also coming from Romania, from further east. And it's important to note that there was a kind of similar migration, though it starts later, of Jews from the Ottoman Empire, from the Balkans and what would become Greece and Turkey, heavily, although not exclusively, bound for South America. So pretty much any place there were old and economically stagnant Jewish communities, there were fresh recruits for this emigration, and this was the way to kind of get it moving.
Let's talk about a little bit about peddlers and their families. Now, by this, there's two parts of this. The first of all is when they picked up and they left Europe, where they were leaving, and they migrated to the United States, wherever they were migrating. As you said, these were men. Were they leaving their family behind? And was the family joining them later? Were they going back? What was that like?
Again, great question. And it depends who and when. So a lot of these, particularly in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, were single men. These were unmarried men. We have by the way, very few figures at our command, but we have some figures and some certainly personal narratives. It was not uncommon for a man who was a peddler and a young guy, I'm talking about 15, 16-year-old boys coming to the United States, and they peddle for a few years. And then one of the first things after getting the horse and wagon is to send to bring over their brothers. Okay. And then they can kind of cover a bigger territory and pool their resources. And then when they've really done well, one of them goes back to the hometown and finds a bride and brings her over, and often brings her sisters and her friends. And they bring Jewish women to create sort of stable Jewish communities. There are certainly some peddlers by, again, the 1860s, 70s who are married. They leave their wives and children back home. Okay. And then they go off and peddle, and then they send for them. And then the third pattern, like the people in Tupper Lake, they actually they all come as a family, but they leave their wives and children in a larger Jewish community where they have family. And then the men go out and they come back at holidays when they're not going to peddle during the Jewish holidays. They come back and reunite for briefly and then go back. So it's all three patterns were there.
Yeah, the second part where they were married and they had wives and children and they left them to go out peddling. I do want to ask you what the impact on the family was. We can talk about that here, or we can talk about that once we discuss maybe we should first get into what was their week like. As you said, this was like a weekly occupation. They went out during the week. So what was kind of their rounds like? We should talk about what they sold. But let's first start out with what was the schedule? What was the routine like for a peddler?
Okay, so what's notable is that the wholesaler, whoever's giving them their goods, it could be a big warehouse, it could just be a kind of store. The wholesaler gives them a route. This is where you're supposed to go. Okay, and they in fact even referred to it as their Medina, their kingdom. And again, the wholesaler might have 5, 6, 7 peddlers all peddling out of his shop. So they each have a separate Medina. Okay. And the peddler gets to his territory. Maybe he needs to take a train or a barge on a canal or some other conveyance to get there. But once he gets there, he has a set route. Monday, you begin with Mrs. Jones and then Mrs. Smith and then Mrs. Whoever. They go to the same homes every Monday, every Tuesday, every Wednesday, every Thursday, and then every Friday. And then Friday, they turn around and get back to where they have to be for the weekend, for the Sabbath. And so that's their cycle. And so during the week, they have essentially no contact with any Jews.
As you said a bunch of times, they would get things from wholesalers. So is that exclusively how it worked? None of them had their own wares. They were essentially selling for someone else. So what were they?
Yeah, they had to sell. Where would they have gotten their own wares? I mean, these are brand new immigrants. And so somebody is setting them up. Somebody is facilitating this. And they were sometimes, they were like jobbers. And so they would give them the stuff to sell. But there are some peddlers who would say to the wholesaler, a lot of people are asking for socks. Okay, good. I'll start stocking socks for you or whatever. But they're not independent business people in as much as they have to, whatever they earn, they split it with the contract, with the wholesaler. The wholesaler gets obviously what he put in and he's going to make a profit. And then the peddler gets his share. So, yeah, they don't have access on their own to stuff.
And they were basically essentially agents. Now, what were they selling? Was it literally anything? Because there was no Amazon in those days. This was like your local Amazon Prime? What was going on?
So, unlike Amazon. So, one thing, they didn't sell anything that we would consider, or that they considered, or people at the time considered absolute necessities. They didn't carry food. They didn't carry fuel. They didn't have wagons of coal, but they sold kind of class of goods that one historian called populux, popular luxuries. So watches, eyeglasses, needles and thread, sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths, rugs for the floor. Now, we would consider those necessities. Right. The thought of sleeping on a bed without a sheet or a blanket seems really hideous. But they have generally very poor customers who, until that era, lived at kind of the lowest level of subsistence. And the peddlers begin to come to a region when people begin to have access to small amounts of cash. And with that cash, they can get curtains for their windows. I think you have curtains there. Well, you don't need them. I mean, I would obviously want them. But for many of these people, a generation earlier didn't even have glass on their windows. And so as their standard of living begins to rise because of a whole range of economic developments, they can spend that money. So there's a great story from Curacao, one of the islands in the Caribbean, where, most of the people were subsistence farmers. Oil comes in and Shell comes in and builds these kind of big housing projects all over Curacao for the workers who had been peasants. So the first time these families have cash. Before they lived in a kind of barter economy. So now they have cash. And they said within a few months, there were Jewish peddlers from Poland honeycombing Curacao to sell their stuff.
So, yeah, it's interesting. Curacao is part of the Netherlands. I think I know Curacao is the baseball players come from Curacao. I think Andrew Jones from Curacao. That's not a familiarity with Curacao, but yes, there was definitely Jews there. So let's go back now just to finish off the family question. Once we talked about, they're kind of being here, those that had families and the families were, let's assume, were locally where they were, they brought them over. What was this impact? Did you see anywhere any specific instances or come across? What was the impact on their family, on them or on their families being separated from the families?
Okay, so they usually bring the families over, or the men get married. They find a bride someplace at that moment where they're going to open a store. So they don't peddle while married. Okay, they don't peddle while the wife and children are there, although there's some exceptions to that. And so when they open, now one reason to open a store and get married is your wife can run the store. You have a set of hands. And there are some cases I saw where the wife would actually run the store and the husband would continue to peddle for some number of years until they had a large family. But one of the things that, again, emerges in some of the narratives is that the women and men had been separated pretty long periods of time. And in the periods of separation, the women became much more independent. They'd been away, their husbands had been gone for 3, 4, 5 years. And so the women had to fend for themselves under difficult circumstances. And we're not terribly interested in returning to a kind of patriarchal authority of, the husband making the key decisions. So there seemed to be some friction in those reconfigured families.
Interesting. Now, let's go to the other angle of things that we haven't really discussed. What is it like for the customers? And the customers, as you mentioned, are unlike the peddlers being men, the customers are usually women. And that's right, as I'll ask you to confirm that. But what was that experience like for them, for the customers on the other end, having these strange peddlers, usually Jews, or as you mentioned, they were Arabs, there were other nationalities, people that didn't necessarily speak their language, strangers coming, knocking on their door. What was that like for them?
Right. So I think it's really hard for us to imagine, because obviously if somebody knocked on my door, I would not let them in. And I certainly wouldn't let them sleep over, which is what the peddlers did. They slept over at the customers' homes at the end of the day. But I think for many of these women, it was so exciting. The idea of when their husbands are off, working in the fields or working in the mines or in the logging camps. And here the woman gets to make this decision. I'll buy this, I'll get that. Some of the women talked about buying jewelry, not expensive stuff, obviously very inexpensive. But they would keep it. They often would never tell their husbands they had it. And they would use it to pawn when things got bad. They could pawn these items they bought. So it was their little economic nest egg. In some cases, and my cousin confirmed this from Cuba, but I saw this in many narratives from Cuba, from Jamaica, from other parts of Central America, that for women, many of the customers were men who were plantation workers, very poorly paid, exploited occupation. But the wives bought for the husbands ties and cloth handkerchiefs and other kind of apparel for the husband, on the premise that when they went into town on the weekend, or they went to church, they wanted their husband to look like a good, like a well-off guy, and not look like a plantation worker. And so they're adding to the kind of public stature of the families. From everything I've seen, women really had a wonderful kind of exchange with the peddlers, and the kids also loved it. It was like it broke up the boredom on an Iowa farm, and in the 1850s. And the women, again, I mentioned before that it was not, it was common. And again, we don't have any numbers to go with this, but that the peddler would spend the night at the home of the last customer of the day. And so, she lets him into her home on the husband's back by then, but he comes into her home, he sits at her table, they sit by the fireplace, they talk, they, get to know each other as kind of real people and not as just strangers. So it plays a really important role in integration, and the women are very much the spearheads of this.
So let's go back to another question I mentioned before. I think there's like the theme over here. I mentioned some things and didn't ask it about the religion. You mentioned religion, meaning the Jewishness that plays into it, the religious aspect. So first of all, you mentioned a lot of times they would stop on Shabbos. So were a lot of these peddlers were religious? That's first.
Yeah.
No, that's the first one. And then, same connected to that question was, how did their religion, if they were religious, how did that impact them and this profession?
Right. Yeah. So, we obviously can't know a lot about them. We don't have that many life histories, but we have little pieces and shreds, and they do add up. And so, for one thing, it was very clear these were not Americans. I mean, they are Brits or South Africa. I mean, these are people with accents who had limited access to the language, that they were foreigners of some kind or another. And they, in a way, shall we say, there wasn't a single story. Some of them were pretty observant. And there are testimonies, as it were, from customers who said, this man would come into our house and he slept over. And in the morning, there was something really strange. He covered himself with this sheet, okay, and was mumbling. Okay, obviously, it was a talit, and he was doing shacharit. And there's a story. Now we know for sure it's true. It's hard to say, but the story is related by the child who grew up in the family. The woman came down and she saw the peddler with these leather strips, what she thought were leather ropes. And she said, Mr. Goldberg is trying to hang himself. She saw the tefillin. And so he explains to her, no, this is, how my people pray. It comes up a lot in stories about food because they would be asked, would you like to eat with us? And some of the peddlers, as they have told their stories, said, I told her I couldn't eat the food that she was serving. So she said, why not? Okay, which is perfectly reasonable. She's never seen a Jew before. She doesn't know anything about Judaism. So my religion does not allow me to eat that food. And rather than take offense, she'd say, tell me what you can eat. And so sometimes the peddlers would actually leave a pot because they always stayed at the same home Monday night or Tuesday night or Wednesday night. They'd leave a pot there and then they would cook for themselves, or she would make vegetables or bread or fruit. And some of the peddlers carried stuff, food with them. There are other peddlers who said, I really, it made me uncomfortable, but I was so tired. I was so hot. I was exhausted. Carrying 150 pounds on my back. I was going to eat anything they gave me. And then what again seems to have shown up or seen many references to it. Then on the weekend, they'd go back to the Jewish community or the Jewish hub. And then there they would have kosher food. But when they're on the road, they said, I just can't do that. And one of my very favorite stories, which I hope was true, because it was, again, told by a child about her father. And she said the father this was in South Dakota, and the father was known by all the customers to be very religious. And his name was Moses, obviously Moshe. So they used to call him Holy Moses. And so at some point in his peddling career, he was approached by several of the customers who said to him, Moses, you're a very religious man, and we have a problem. Our minister died. This is actually a German colony. Our minister died, and is there any chance you could come to our church on Sunday morning and lead services for us? You're a religious man. And so if the daughter's story was, obviously he didn't lead them in hymns or whatever he said, but he would come and teach the Parsha of the week. And she said he was so proud that he told them about Rashi. And so this went on for several months. There was another case I saw where a couple of Jewish peddlers in Tennessee were hired by the local Baptist Sunday school to teach the kids because they had no teachers. So these are guys who knew Bible stories. And in many places in the American South, in South Africa, the story repeated over and over again is that the family at night, the customer's family at night would read the Bible together. And they would turn to the peddler and they said, you're one of the Hebrew people from the Bible. You're one of the chosen people. Would you read the Bible for us? So what it does is, in fact, as a historical phenomenon in all of these places, particularly in the Protestant countries, create a kind of religious tolerance The people who've never seen Jews, who had no idea what that meant before, are able to transcend the boundaries of their own religious tradition. And for the Jews, well, these aren't the bad people, we associate with Christians. Really nice. And so then it became a kind of, I'd say, step in a process of creating a kind of religious tolerance beyond the religious tolerance demanded by the law.
Now, you mentioned their toleration of these Jews, but what about the other side? What about the ugly side of the anti-Semitism? Especially because, was there there must have been pushback, especially because, just think about it, these are strangers coming in and suddenly they're selling wares. And you can imagine, one can imagine that now these customers are not shopping at local stores or from the local, and there's going from these outsiders that are Jewish. And what did you see in the sources? What do you see as the pushback to that, and any specific instances or just in general? What was the attitude like? Maybe it wasn't the same in all places.
Yeah. So, I think, again, it's a great question. So on the one hand, just because I'm always interested in comparing and seeing this in context, the rhetoric against the Yankee peddlers, so Protestant guys from New England, was the same rhetoric that was used against the Jews, but they would just call them sharp Yankees. These sharp Yankees, they know how to talk. They can always talk women into buying things they don't need. So they said that, okay, these sharp Jews can always talk women. So how anti-Semitic was that if they were using that same rhetoric and just naming the culprit, as it were? But yes, and where there was opposition to Jewish peddlers, it came from the local merchants. Because they really resented these guys don't pay taxes, they don't pay rent, they don't have any of the expenses we have. And meanwhile, they can undersell us, and they can bring the curtains into a woman's home and show them how beautiful it looks on their own windows. We can't do that. So, there's resentment. And in a few places, at a few times, there was organized resistance, organized action against the peddlers. It happens in Ireland, in Limerick in 1903, 1904. Georgia tried to pass a law that said you couldn't get a peddler's license unless you were a citizen, which for these guys, it made no sense because it was a job that a new immigrant took. And there was something similar to that in North Carolina and South Carolina. But for the most part, they... I'll just give an example. There was an oral history project done in Atlanta in the 1970s, and they were interviewing the last old Jewish men who had been peddlers. And the interviewer said, well, do you want to say anything about the anti-Semitism you experienced? And of we didn't experience any. People were really nice to us. And, one of the sources I saw was the peddler knocks on the door of a new customer. Woman opens her door and she screams, I don't let Yankees into my house. And he says, I'm not a Yankee, I'm a Jew. He said, oh, then you can come in. So, yes, we should note they were robbed. A couple of them were murdered. And in these oral histories, again, was said, look, they didn't rob us because we were Jews. They robbed us because we were men on the road with cash and with goods, watches and jewelry. So, yes, there was opposition, but I think the real story is the story of the mutual integration, the Jews integrating into the societies in which they settled, certain places in particular, and in a way, how the local people expanded their idea of what it means to be an American, what it means to be South African, what it means to be British. To me, that's the real takeaway, and not the fact that there was this episode of anti-Semitism in that episode.
Right. And as you're saying, even when there was opposition, that opposition was opposition to outsiders, whatever the outsiders were,
Exactly.
Opposition to outsiders. Okay.
Right.
What impact would you say that, let's focus on the United States here. What impact would you say that the peddlers had on the United States? So they're obviously, as you're saying, there was an impact on them. They ended up integrating into society. You have Jews all over. You mentioned right in the beginning, and you have the shul, you have, these communities, things ending up all over. But what impact did they have, vice versa, on the community, on the United States as a whole?
Well, they make it possible for people to work in mining camps or to work in logging camps or to move out to Nebraska or Oregon and not be bereft of material goods. So in a way, they're really important, I'd say, foot soldiers in economic development of the United States. And they again, expand the ideas Americans have of who belongs here. And so many of these peddlers, when they finish peddling, and it's never a lifetime occupation, it's 5 years, 4 years, whenever, 6 years, they usually become shopkeepers in the region where they peddled, and they become respected members of the community. They serve on the Board of Education. They serve on the road commission. And so, in fact, perhaps circling back, as we're probably coming to some kind of end here, circling back in that Tupper Lake story, by 1930, one of the former peddlers had become the mayor of Tupper Lake. And and we see these, by the way, in obituaries. Thank God for the internet, so you could get all these obituaries from small town newspapers, and it would have, Hyman Goldberg came to Gastonia, North Carolina, 1897, from Russian Poland as a pack peddler. And then you can follow his career, and he ends up, founder of the synagogue, and belongs to the Masons and to the Odd Fellows, and serves on the county highway commission. So he's a respected member of the local community, and that local community is essentially a different place for having Jews there.
What about any famous figures or famous families that come? I think the Guggenheims. What about some of the famous families or figures, people that, I guess, names that maybe listeners would be familiar with that come from?
Well, Guggenheim is certainly one of them. Strauss. Okay, both the Strausses who are associated with Macy's. One of them, Oscar Strauss, becomes the son of a peddler, first Jew to serve in a cabinet. And his brother, Isidor Strauss, actually went down on the Titanic. They became fabulously wealthy. The Lehman brothers start out as peddlers in Alabama. Julius Rosenwald, who, according to one count, is the 59th richest person in American history. His father, Samuel Rosenwald, came as a peddler and married a woman who was the sister of his wholesalers. Rosenwald has a tremendous impact on American society, and really so many more. But, those are the really big names, Guggenheim, Lehman, Strauss, and then Levi Strauss of blue jean fame. And those are the big national or global names. But if you go into any city, Milwaukee, Chicago, Atlanta, wherever, the big department stores were all owned by former peddlers. And so the people in Atlanta knew Rich's. I mean, Rich's was the sort of marquee department store. Well, the Rich brothers were Hungarian Jewish immigrants who came in a kind of chain of brothers to peddle. So if you lived in Atlanta, Rich's would be the place you went for kind of anything special.
So what was the end of the peddlers, and how did that happen? What led to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it ended first because immigration ends, and it ended also because of automobiles and highways, and even ironically, two of the biggest catalogs where you could buy stuff by mail was the Spiegel catalog. They were peddlers, and Rosenwald was associated with Sears Roebuck. So the Sears catalog. So if you could buy from the catalog sitting in your home, that undermined it. And the mail service got better. But mostly it was the end of immigration and the transportation revolution that gave farm families or even poor families, a car to get into town.
What sources did you use for this? You mentioned oral history. Were there written sources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there were, I always say I used everything. So for one thing, newspapers were amazing, both Jewish and general. And it was through the blessings of the internet that one could sit in New York and read South African newspapers where the word peddler popped up. But also there were government reports. There were reports of Jewish community officials or Jewish community leaders who generally didn't like the peddlers. There were memoirs. I mentioned before that there were a few cases in the United States of peddlers getting murdered. And so there were government inquests, over, trying to solve the crime. So that offered me a lot of stuff, a lot of, great information, what the peddler was carrying, what the customers said. I got a tremendous amount there's a credit rating agency called RG Dunn, which is the forerunner of Dunn and Bradstreet. And they hired agents to kind of surreptitiously cover the activities of businessmen in town to find out how creditworthy they were. And so the people who were these agents, would always say, so-and-so is a Jew, a former peddler or a peddler. And then he'd say his customers think of him as honest and sober. His customers rely upon him. So the RNG, these are handwritten reports from these credit rating agencies, or their agents, and that gave me a tremendous amount of material. Biographies, obviously, and autobiographies.
Okay. So just finally, I guess as a final question, when you set out, as you said in the beginning, how you got into this, how surprised or not surprised were you by what you found? Was this what you thought?
Good. Again, it's a great question. I was blown away by how much there was. And so I went on one search engine that connects university news archives all over the United States. And I typed in the word Jewish peddlers, and I got something like 8 million hits. And obviously I couldn't see 8 million sources, but I was amazed at how much there was, and how, without glorifying myself, how right I was that first this was an interesting story, that it was a real human story, and that it was a story that made these very ordinary guys who trudged the road important players in modern Jewish history. And I was right to focus on them.
Okay, so I will link to the book in the show's notes for those interested in purchasing it. And thank you, Professor Diner, for joining me.
My pleasure.
Us, the Jewish Peddlers.
Okay, lovely. Okay.
Thank you.